Saxon times it was known as loos. The modern term for toilet might have come from it, I suppose. I'm Keith Hayes, and you'll be sick and tired of my face by the time this series ends, but I hope you'll bear with me as I shuffle through the streets of this lovely town, pop in and out of its pubs, and tell you a story of its bloody past. But the town became respectable and is now known as Lewes. That's Lou-is, not lose. But its original name does come from Saxon times. And this pretty little town in East Sussex, nicely tucked under the shelter of the South Downs, has had this high street for longer than written records go back. Pretty normal sort of UK high street, really. Typical shops and stores each side of it. Looks just like High Street UK. High Street UK, from John O'Groats to Land's End, have all got a history. But this little stretch of road has a violent and bloody history. And that history reflects much of the history of the country itself. A pint pulled from a tap is the tipple of most Englishmen, I suspect. They sure tippled in Lewes in the past. This pub goes back to 1742. There's a list of the landlords to prove it. Today, sitting on the high street, it's one of the 16 pubs in a town of 16,000. 150 years ago, there were 63 pubs in Lewes and 18 breweries. And in those days, there were only 9,000 people. Wow, what a tall tale. Yes, but true. And over the next few programmes, I'm going to take a closer look at some of the bloodier and more sensational events that have occurred on this seemingly normal high street. But right now, I'm just going to paint a general picture of this tiny English town, before I get to the bloody and the exotic. The high street is dominated by a Norman castle, one of the oldest Norman castles in the country. It was built not long after the invasion of 1066. It housed the Norman garrison, who ensured the people living inside its walls were kept safe. Indeed, Lewes was a walled town, and there is brick-by-brick evidence of the 4 gates that gave entry to the town. By the way, Lewes isn't a corruption of Lou. It's the Saxon word for a hill. And if you thought that Lewes had lots of pubs, it has far more hilly roads. Far more even than the rest of the country, I think. The modern-day Lewes is well used by its people. Lots of shops, markets, and even tea rooms. It also has a lot of parades. At the end of the school year, a ceremony takes place called patina. All year long, pupils design and build exotic costumes ready to parade down the high street. Raphael, I walked onto the high street in Lewes a couple of years ago to be greeted with a lot of children running around in funny costumes. What on earth is that all about?
It's called Moving on Parade, and it's something we started 16 years ago. It started from a wish of parents to bring more art into schools because they see how much schools struggle with demands of the government, and they wanted to support the school in that. So we started something called Patina, which is parents and teachers in the arts. Right. Moving on Parade celebrates the transition primary to secondary education of all the children in Lewis District Council.
Very colourful costumes. How do you decide what the costumes are? You're the artistic director, so you better give me a good answer on this.
So every year we have a theme. The theme this year is Wonders of Our World. Last year we asked the community to suggest different artists that they would like to see on the parade, and loads of suggestions came in, and we shortlisted the huge list into 16 schools, which was the amount of schools that took part last year. We had Frida Kahlo, and we had Picasso, and we had Van Gogh, and we have Giacometti, and we had Andy Warhol. So they doing illustrations and designs, and then the patina artists take all the children's idea and adapt it into a practical design that the children are actually able to make in a couple of days. We invite about 8 or 10 people from every school to come and learn the skills of the carnival costume, and they start to make the big make that the school going to carry. And after that, the patina artists going into the school and work with the children on their individual costumes. We're trying to really do it as an enjoyment, getting people together. They're all gonna meet in their secondary school later on. We're trying that they'll meet each other beforehand as well. So we're doing events all year round for the benefit of the whole community, not just for the year sixes.
The adults have their turn, and on November the 5th, the biggest Guy Fawkes celebration anywhere in the world takes place. Exotic costumes, burning crosses, effigies stuffed with fireworks. Rousers, that is a banger to you and I, are tossed casually into the street. And almost every citizen of the town, old and young, takes part. There's a bit more to the bonfire celebration, though, than just the gunpowder plot. In 1553, Queen Mary was determined to bring Roman Catholicism back to England. Right here on the High Street, she burned 17 people at the stake who wouldn't convert. The dungeon, where they were held before being so horribly slaughtered, is still here, being the last steps the condemned men would take. It was a horrible death. They were put into tar barrels, which were then set alight. Pretty bloody stuff. But we'll leave the High Street for a few minutes, then we'll bring you more gore, blood and guts.
I'm here in the village of Charleston, a charming, picturesque British village with a population of 500.
That's not Charleston, Keith. This is Charleston, South Carolina. A charming, picturesque village with a population of 120,000 in the United States.
What about this town, Boston? 120 miles north of London in England. Population, 35,000.
That's not Boston. This is the real Boston. Boston, Massachusetts, population 4 million.
What about this lovely little city, York? I suppose you Yankees have one of those too.
Yes, we do. Welcome to the new and improved York.
Now here's one you can't beat, London. That's London in England. Population, 8 million.
Okay, I'll give you that one.
Join us for a journey to different cities with the same name.
A new show comparing big American cities with the small British and European towns that share the same name.
We never should have let you win that little war, Melissa.
Actually, Keith, we beat you at 2 little wars.
What's in a name?
Coming soon to public television.
Ever constructed on the Ireland Islands, it was a formidable fortress surrounded by huge perimeter battlements. The defences could house a garrison of more than 4,000 officers and men. Built to withstand a long siege, it even included an Orthodox church to provide spiritual sustenance for the defenders. John Bleach is the senior custodian for the Sussex Archaeological Society. He's made a special study of the Russian prisoners.
The Bommersund campaign, a combined French-English naval force went to Bommersund to capture the fortress there to allow access into the Gulf of Finland, where they could then get to St. Petersburg, of course the old capital of the Russian Empire. It was a bit of an Achilles heel in a sense for the Russians, but Bommersund was a very powerful fort. The naval force did what they went to do, captured the fort, captured 2,000 plus prisoners in the process, and it was those prisoners who were shipped back through the Baltic, through the North Sea to England and France.
That's how the Russian prisoners were captured, but how did more than 300 of them end up in Lewes, deep in the English countryside?
I'm not sure, but I suspect we had the county jail opened in 1853, and I think that probably means that the naval prison where the Russian prisoners were kept had become empty of ordinary prisoners, and I suspect that's why it was used. I can't think of any better reason.
Suddenly, the English and the French authorities have a huge number of prisoners of war to deal with, over 2,000, and it's rather an embarrassing situation. So the prisoners are put onto boats for a time being. It's obviously quite apparent you can't keep prisoners of war in that sort of situation. And I think the Admiralty here in Britain had looked around for a solution to the problem, and it became apparent that the county jail here was available. So the Admiralty purchased the county jail for £5,000 and then set about tidying it up, I think is the best word.
The government was expecting to have prisoners of war from the Crimean coming in, and in fact they bought the old prison in 1854, in the summer of 1854, I think for £5,000, such is the way of property prices now that £5,000 in Lewes would hardly gain you a blade of grass, let alone a whole old prison.
Today, the site of Lewes's naval prison is a car park. The incarceration of the prisoners of war is remembered in a plaque attached to what little remains of the prison walls. The building was pulled down in the 60s to make room for a bypass that was never built. John Cheeseman remembers visiting it as a boy.
It was a very forbidding place. There's still only the perimeter wall left, but the rest of the building was made in similar sort of bricks and so on, which are rather dark. And if one went into the cells, and I recall going into them, they were not only small, but they were very dark too, very little, if any, natural light.
This was what the prison looked like when the British Admiralty bought it to house the prisoners of war.
So they bought the prison, and they made many adaptations to it. One of them, interestingly, they took the doors off the cells.
Good for freedom of movement, but not so good for privacy. The doors survive in the local museum, all that remains of the prison's interior. The prisoners were separated. The enlisted men, mostly Finns, Swedes and a few Ireland Islanders, were put into the prison, 3 to a cell. But it was a different situation for the Russian officers.
The officers, very different case. They were billeted out amongst the gentry families of the town and surrounding areas, not just Lewes. They had freedom of movement, they had freedom of association, and they generally joined in, if you like, middle to gentry class society. So we have an account, for example, of the officers being very popular dancing partners at local balls because they could waltz so much better than Englishmen. There we go.
Not all the Russians lost themselves in the pleasures of the waltz. Many, like Georgi, found captivity in Lewis a heavy burden to bear, despite their almost complete freedom of movement around the town. However, they respected their captors. In his memoirs, Georgi praises the citizens of Lewis and admits that they gave us sufficient allowance to live quite well. And one of the elements in their well-being was beer. In the 19th century, beer was a staple in the diet of rural England. The average family in Lewis spent over 25% of its income on beer, and the town had 9 breweries working day and night. Today, only one remains, but it still has sole rights to brew Imperial Russian Double Stout, originally given royal warrant by Catherine the Great. It's a very unusual beer, 9% alcohol with 3 times the bitterness of a modern beer. The chief brewer says that it provides a genuine experience of the actual taste of 19th century brews.
What you end up with is a very sweet and sour beer, but one which is well balanced and has strange flavour notes. I've heard it described as tar, leather, blue cheese. I just think it is a well balanced, slightly burnt, sweet and sour beer. A marvellous, sweet, slightly burnt, molasses-like nose to it. And a very full, round, burnt, very slightly astringent palate. Good bitterness, good sweetness, and each of them rounding off to this peculiar beer, which is very much, I say, a taste of the past.
The Russians seem to have been treated very well indeed, considering the fact that they were prisoners of war. The Russian embassy in London has had a long history of contact with Lewis. During the incarceration, the embassy was directly involved in the welfare of the prisoners. The current ambassador explains why the Russians were so well looked after.
I think it is somewhat unique, and of course we have to bear in mind that that happened in the middle of 19th century, and at that time the art of war, the traditions of war were a little bit different of the present days. And they had this kind of a gentleman attitude towards the prisoners, in spite of the fact that at that time such things as Geneva Convention have not yet existed. We know many examples in 18th and 19th centuries when officers and soldiers taken prisoners were well treated in Russia. There have been no persecutions, no concentration camps, and then some of them even got decorations from the Russian Tsar.
Georgi spent time studying local maps, but it was a long way back to Russia and few prisoners attempted escape, though it wasn't hard. 2 grenadiers simply walked out of the prison, took the boat to Hamburg and arrived without incident at the Russian embassy there. The people of Lewis simply took the prisoners to their hearts. That warmth continues today.
By the way, Lewes isn't a corruption of Lou. It's the Saxon word for a hill. And if you thought that Lewes had lots of pubs, it has far more hilly roads. Far more even than the rest of the country, I think. I'm Keith Hayes, and you'll be sick and tired of my face by the time this series ends, but I hope you'll bear with me as I shuffle through the streets of this lovely town, pop in and out of its pubs, and tell you a story of its bloody past. They sure tippled in Lewes in the past. Yes, yes. My bank? Yes, yes. Of course. Absolutely. Right away. Hello, I'm Keith Hayes, with another edition of our crime show, Catch 'em. Oh, by the way, there's one crime that's still on the statute books that I haven't mentioned, and that's ringing somebody's doorbell and running away. Hello, darling. I'll be late home for dinner. How very thoughtful of me to let the good lady know. But if you do it while driving your car on your handheld mobile, it will be an expensive meal. Ye merry gentlemen. Nice to hear carol singers, unless they're warbling like me. But then, make sure that you ask if you know them. Oh, what a misery I am. But it's my job to catch the criminals. That's what I do. Then don't let me catch you eating mince pies on Christmas Day. Oliver Cromwell banned them around 1654 because he thought gluttony was a threat to the human figure. Some say it's still on the statute books, but there's nobody around but me. Here we go again. Pubs in Lewes. You can't get away from them. There's a tale handed down from Crown landlord to Crown landlord that Tom Paine was barred from drinking in that bar because he harassed and harangued the regulars to the point where they wouldn't drink anymore. They were fed up with Tom preaching the rights of man. So he walked across the street to the coaching inn, the White Hart. I think the government stinks. And I think the last government stank. And what's more, I think the government even before that stank. Whether I believe that or not is quite irrelevant. What is important is whether I can say it without being locked up by the King's men. It wasn't always so. The rights enjoyed in a free democracy started right here. It was here, near to the High Street, that blood was shed in the name of freedom.
But then went on to, as king, ratified the clauses of the Magna Carta and the provisions of Oxford, and those began to change the king's power. And it also meant things like, if a woman died as a widow, her dowry money was hers. It didn't need to be given over to her husband's family and sons and what have you.
That's the start of women's rights as well.
There you go.
My goodness.
There you go. The Normans.
High Street, UK. Every high street has a history, and there are thousands of high streets across the country. And this is just one of them. More high street tales tomorrow. Meanwhile, where's that pint? But this is Lewes, remember. Nothing is ever what it seems. The horses had ploughed up the ground a bit, so the surface wasn't even. So bowling in Lewes is completely unique. Quite capable of doing that. And very difficult. So there you go. Not quite one man, one vote, but some slight recognition that the divine right of kings isn't exactly what the Almighty had in mind. From bloody red to deadly black. Next episode, how rats destroyed a major port and brought more historical carnage to Lewis. Until then, a bloody goodbye. Poor old Lewis. I need a drink.
Thank you.